The poster was barely recognizable. Creased down the middle, torn at one corner, stained with what looked like rain or motor oil. A man walked up to Johnny Cash backstage at the Arizona State Fair in Phoenix, September 1967, handed it to him without a word, and left before anyone could ask his name. Cash stood there holding it, staring at something printed across the top that made his face go still. What was on that poster shouldn't have existed anymore. Not publicly. Not in the hands of a stranger. And certainly not with the handwriting along the margin, handwriting Cash recognized immediately, though the person who'd written it had been dead for 3 years. The torn poster became one of those objects that carries more weight than paper should. It sat in Cash's tour bus for weeks, then in a drawer at his home in California, then eventually in a locked box he rarely opened. He never spoke about it in interviews. Never mentioned it in his autobiography. But people who were close to him during that time, June Carter, Marshall Grant, a few others, remembered the change in him after Phoenix. Something quieter. Something that looked like guilt, or maybe just a slow realization that certain debts don't get paid in full, no matter how long you live. Phoenix in 1967 was still a small enough city that you could feel the desert pressing in from all sides. The fairgrounds sat on the eastern edge of town, a flat stretch of dirt and temporary stages where the air smelled like livestock and funnel cakes and gasoline from the carnival rides. Cash was scheduled to play 2 shows that weekend, part of a tour that had him zigzagging across the Southwest in a bus that broke down more often than it should have. He was 35 years old. His career was in a strange place, not failing, but not quite thriving either. The hits were still coming, but slower. The pills were still happening, but faster. He'd been arrested earlier that year trying to cross the border with amphetamines hidden in his guitar case, and though the charges were eventually dropped, the story lingered. People whispered about him the way they whisper about men who are burning through something they can't replace. The man who brought the poster showed up during the late afternoon, a few hours before the first show. Security was loose back then. You could walk right up to the staging area if you looked like you belonged, and this man did, middle-aged, wearing a denim jacket and work boots, the kind of person who blended into every crowd west of the Mississippi. He asked for Cash by name. When someone pointed him toward the dressing trailer, he walked over, waited until Cash stepped outside for a cigarette, and simply handed him the poster. No explanation. No introduction. Just a folded piece of paper that had clearly been carried for a long time. Then he turned and walked back through the fairgrounds, past the Ferris wheel and the livestock barns, and disappeared into the late-day crowd. By the time anyone thought to follow him, he was gone. Cash unfolded the poster slowly. It was an old concert flyer from 1964, advertising a show at a honky-tonk in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The kind of place that doesn't exist anymore, wood floors, chicken wire around the stage to keep the bottles from hitting the band, a bar that served whiskey in plastic cups. Cash had played there during a particularly rough stretch, one of dozens of similar venues he'd worked that year while trying to keep his career from collapsing entirely. The poster itself wasn't remarkable. What was remarkable was the note written in blue ink along the left margin, in handwriting that belonged to a man named Luther Perkins. Luther Perkins had been Cash's lead guitarist since the beginning. The two of them, along with bassist Marshall Grant, had formed the Tennessee Two back in Memphis in 1954, playing small shows and recording sessions at Sun Records under Sam Phillips. Perkins had a distinctive style, sparse, rhythmic, almost percussive. He didn't play solos. He played atmosphere. That boom-chicka-boom sound that became synonymous with Cash's early records was as much Luther's creation as anyone's. He was quiet offstage, careful with words, the kind of musician who let the work speak for itself. And on August 5, 1968, he died in a house fire in Tennessee. The official story was that he'd fallen asleep while smoking, that the blaze started in the bedroom and spread quickly. He was 40 years old. Cash had been devastated. The funeral was small. The grief was large. But this poster was from 1967, a full year before Luther died. And the note scrawled along the margin, in his handwriting, read, "Johnny, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. You need to know what happened in Tulsa wasn't an accident. The fire wasn't either. Someone's been following us since then. Watch yourself. LP. Now, there's no record of this note in any official archive. No mention of it in the biographies written about Cash or Perkins. No documentation in the boxes of memorabilia that eventually made their way to museums or private collections. But the people who were close to Cash during that period remember him changing after Phoenix. He became more careful. Started paying attention to who was around him, who was asking questions. He stopped talking to certain reporters. He started traveling with the curtains in the bus drawn, even during the day. June Carter noticed it first. She'd asked him what was wrong, and he'd say nothing, but his eyes told a different story. Marshall Grant later recalled a conversation where Cash asked him, almost casually, if he remembered anything strange about that night in Tulsa, back in 1964. Grant said no. Cash didn't press it. But the question hung there. So what happened in Tulsa? The records are thin, but not entirely absent. The show took place on a Thursday night in late April 1964, at a venue called the Blue Moon Lounge. It was a rough room, even by the standards of the honky-tonk circuit. The owner had connections to local gambling operations, and the clientele reflected that: oil workers, drifters, people passing through on their way to somewhere else. Cash and the band were paid in cash, no contracts, no receipts. The performance went fine, by all accounts. They played the usual set. Folsom Prison Blues, I Walk the Line. A few newer songs that hadn't quite caught on yet. The crowd was loud and half-drunk, but that was normal. What wasn't normal was what happened after the show. According to a police report filed 3 days later, there was an altercation in the parking lot behind the Blue Moon around midnight. 2 men were involved, though the report doesn't name them. One of them was taken to a local hospital with a broken jaw and lacerations across his face. The other man left the scene before police arrived. No charges were filed. The injured man refused to cooperate with investigators, and the case was quietly closed. The report sat in a filing cabinet in the Tulsa Police Department for decades, unnoticed, until a researcher digging through old records in the 1990s found it, and flagged it as potentially related to Cash's tour schedule. But by then, everyone involved was either dead or unwilling to talk. There's a photograph from that night, though. One photograph, taken by someone in the crowd and later sold to a collector. It shows Cash and Luther Perkins standing near the tour bus, both of them looking off to the left, towards something outside the frame. Cash's expression is hard to read, focused, maybe, or concerned. Perkins looks tense. In the background, barely visible, there's a man in a dark coat standing near the edge of the parking lot, watching them. His face is too shadowed to make out clearly, but his posture suggests he's not there by accident. The photograph was never published. It surfaced years later in an estate sale, tucked inside a box of other miscellaneous images from the 1960s. The person who bought it didn't know what they had. It's in a private collection now, rarely seen. Luther Perkins wasn't the kind of person who scared easily. People who knew him described him as steady, unflappable, the kind of man who could walk into a chaotic situation and find the calm center of it. So when he wrote that note, if he wrote it, something significant must have happened. Something that stayed with him long enough to put it on paper, to hide it in a poster, to arrange for it to reach Cash in the event of his death. The question is, what did he see in Tulsa that made him believe someone was following them? And why would that same someone want to start a fire 3 years later? The official investigation into Luther Perkins's death was brief. The fire started around 5 a.m. on August 5, 1968, in the bedroom of his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. Perkins was found near the doorway, overcome by smoke inhalation. The coroner ruled it accidental, citing evidence of cigarette ash near the bed and noting that Perkins had been drinking the night before. The case was closed within a week. No one questioned it. No one had reason to. Except that the fire burned unusually hot for a residential blaze. And there were trace amounts of accelerant detected in the debris, gasoline, specifically, though this was attributed to a lawnmower stored in the garage. The report noted it as incidental. Not suspicious. Just one of those things. Cash didn't attend the funeral right away. He was on tour in California when he got the news, and by the time he made it back to Tennessee, the service had already taken place. He visited the grave alone, late at night, and stood there for nearly an hour without saying a word. June was with him, waiting in the car. She later told a friend that when Johnny came back, he looked like someone had taken something from him that he'd never get back. Not just a friend. Not just a bandmate. Something deeper. Some piece of the machinery that had been holding him together. If you enjoy stories that hide more than they reveal, you might want to stay with this one a little longer. Because what happened next doesn't make sense unless you believe that some narratives don't end where they're supposed to. 3 months after Luther's death, Cash received a letter. No return address, postmarked from Oklahoma City. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Luther knew. You know. Don't make the same mistake. That was all. No signature. No explanation. Cash showed the letter to Marshal Grant, who immediately suggested they take it to the police. Cash refused. He said it was probably just some crank, someone trying to capitalize on grief. But he kept the letter. It went into the same locked box as the torn poster, the same box he rarely opened. Grant later said he didn't push it. He knew Johnny well enough to recognize when a door was closed. The tour in the fall of 1968 was difficult for everyone. Luther Perkins, no relation to Luther, stepped in to play lead guitar, and while he was talented, the chemistry wasn't the same. Cash was drinking more, sleeping less, showing up late to sound checks. The pills were a constant. He'd take them to stay awake during travel, then take something else to come down after a show. It was a rhythm he'd been locked into for years, but after Luther's death, it seemed to accelerate. June tried to intervene. So did a few others. But Cash had a way of deflecting concern, of making it seem like everything was under control even when it clearly wasn't. He played the shows. He hit the notes. He kept moving. That was the job. But there were moments when the mask slipped. A radio interview in Dallas that November, for example, where the host asked Cash about Luther's death. Cash's answer was clipped, almost hostile. He said Luther had been a good friend and a great musician, and then he changed the subject. The host, sensing tension, didn't press it. But if you listen to the recording now, you can hear something in Cash's voice, not just grief, but anger. And underneath that, maybe something closer to fear. Was someone actually following them? It's easy to dismiss the idea as paranoia, especially given Cash's drug use during that period. Amphetamines are notorious for inducing suspicion, for making people see patterns that aren't there. But there's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. And when you start pulling at the threads of what happened in Tulsa, in Phoenix, in the months following Luther's death, a picture starts to emerge. Not a clear picture. But something. The Blue Moon Lounge in Tulsa burned down in 1971. Another fire, another official ruling of accidental cause. The building had been sitting vacant for 2 years by that point, so no one was hurt. But the timing is worth noting. The owner, a man named Harold Finch, had died 6 months earlier of a heart attack. His financial records, which might have shed light on his business dealings, disappeared shortly after his death. Family members claimed they'd been stolen, though no police report was ever filed. The land where the Blue Moon stood was sold to a developer in 1972 and is now a strip mall. There's a nail salon where the stage used to be. Harold Finch is an interesting character in all of this, even though his name rarely comes up. He ran the Blue Moon for nearly 15 years, from the mid-1950s through the late 1960s, and during that time, the venue developed a reputation as a place where certain kinds of business could be conducted quietly. Gambling, mostly. Some loan sharking. Possibly other things. Finch himself was never charged with anything, but his name appears in a few FBI files from the period, always in the margins, always as an associate or a known contact, never as a primary target. He knew people. he facilitated things. And he booked musicians like Johnny Cash, who needed the money and weren't too particular about where it came from. There's a story, unverified, passed around among people who were part of that scene, that Finch had connections to organized crime figures operating out of Kansas City and Dallas. Nothing major, but enough to make him useful. The theory, if you can call it that, is that something happened the night Cash played the Blue Moon, something involving Finch and his associates, and that Luther Perkins witnessed it. Maybe he saw a transaction he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he heard a conversation. Maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And maybe, 3 years later, someone decided that risk needed to be eliminated. But why wait 3 years? That's the question that doesn't quite fit. If Luther had seen something dangerous in 1964, why would anyone wait until 1968 to act? One possibility is that he didn't become a problem until later. Maybe he started asking questions, or mentioned something to the wrong person. Maybe he tried to use what he knew as leverage for something else entirely. Or maybe the fire in 1968 wasn't about Luther at all. Maybe it was a message meant for someone else, someone like Johnny Cash, who'd been playing venues like the Blue Moon for years, who'd been moving in circles where cash transactions and unspoken agreements were part of the landscape. Cash himself never said. Not publicly anyway. But there are small clues scattered through the years that followed. In 1969, he started turning down certain gigs, particularly in Oklahoma and parts of Texas. His management at the time attributed this to scheduling conflicts, but people close to him noticed a pattern. He avoided specific venues, specific cities. When asked why, he'd give vague answers about bad acoustics or difficult travel logistics. But the real reason, some believe, was that he didn't want to go back to places where he'd have to look over his shoulder. Then there's the matter of the man in Phoenix. The one who delivered the poster. No one ever identified him. Security footage from the fairgrounds, assuming it even existed, is long gone. The people who were working backstage that day have either passed away or don't remember the incident clearly enough to provide useful details. But a few years ago, a woman in Scottsdale came forward with a story. She said her father had worked as a stagehand at the Arizona State Fair in the 1960s, and that he'd mentioned, late in his life, an encounter with a man who'd asked very specific questions about when Johnny Cash would be arriving and where he'd be before the show. Her father thought it was odd at the time but didn't think much of it. He told the man where the dressing trailers were and went back to work. It wasn't until decades later, when he heard about the torn poster story from someone else in the industry, that he wondered if the two incidents were connected. The woman's father died in 2003. She has no documentation to support the story, just the memory of a conversation. But it adds another piece to something that might be a puzzle, or might just be a collection of coincidences that happen to look meaningful when you line them up a certain way. There's a recording that surfaced in the 1990s, an audio tape from a private session Cash did in 1969. It's not a polished recording, just him and a guitar, working through ideas for songs that never made it onto an album. At one point, between takes, he starts talking to whoever's in the room with him. The tape quality is poor, and parts of it are inaudible, but you can make out a few sentences. He says something about Tulsa, something about Luther, and then he says, "I should have known better. I should have walked away." The other person in the room says something back, but it's too faint to hear. Cash laughs, but it's not a happy sound. Then he starts playing again, and the conversation is over. What should he have known? And walked away from what? The tape doesn't answer those questions. It just hangs there, like so many other fragments. People forget how dangerous the music business could be back then. Not dangerous in the way it is now, with contracts and litigation. Dangerous in a more direct sense. Venues were often controlled by people who had their hands in other industries, industries where disputes were settled in ways that didn't involve lawyers. Musicians, especially touring musicians, moved through that world constantly. They saw things. They heard things. And most of them had the good sense to keep their mouths shut. But every once in a while, someone didn't. And when that happened, the consequences could be severe. Luther Perkins was a quiet man, but quiet doesn't mean blind. He'd been on the road with Cash for over a decade by the time Tulsa happened. He'd played hundreds of venues, met thousands of people, seen the full spectrum of how that world operated. If he witnessed something in Tulsa that worried him enough to write a warning note 3 years later, it's worth considering that he knew exactly what he was talking about. That he understood the stakes. And that he was trying to protect someone he cared about, even if it meant implicating himself in something he couldn't fully explain. The question of who delivered the poster in Phoenix remains unanswered. Some people think it was a friend of Luther's, someone he'd entrusted with the task of getting the message to Cash in the event of his death. Others think it might have been someone with a guilty conscience, someone who knew what had happened and wanted to give Cash a chance to protect himself. There's even a theory, unlikely, but not impossible, that Luther himself arranged the delivery before he died, using an intermediary he trusted. But none of these theories can be confirmed, because the man who handed Cash the poster has never been found. Where are you watching this from? And when you look around the room you're in right now, do you ever wonder what objects might carry stories you'll never know? The locked box that held the poster and the letter stayed with Cash for the rest of his life. After he died in 2003, June had already passed away a few months earlier, and the estate was divided among his children. The box ended up with one of his daughters, though which one has never been publicly disclosed. In 2007, there were rumors that some of its contents might be auctioned, but nothing ever materialized. The poster, if it still exists, is somewhere in a private collection, inaccessible to researchers or historians. The letter from 1968 is presumably in the same place. Unless someone in the family decides to share them, they'll remain locked away, just more pieces of a story that refuses to stay buried but also refuses to come fully into the light. There's something almost poetic about that. Cash built his career on songs about guilt, redemption, and the things men carry. He sang about prisoners and outlaws and people living on the margins, people with secrets they couldn't quite shake. And here, at the end of it all, he became one of them. A man holding on to something he couldn't talk about, something that weighed on him in ways no one outside his inner circle could fully understand. Did someone follow them after Tulsa? Did Luther's death have a cause beyond the official explanation? Was the fire in 1968 an accident, or was it something else? These questions don't have clean answers. Maybe they never will. But the absence of answers doesn't mean the questions aren't worth asking. Because sometimes the gaps in a story are where the truth actually lives. Phoenix in September 1967 was hot, the kind of dry heat that makes everything shimmer. Cash played his shows that weekend, and by all accounts, they went well. He didn't mention the poster to anyone outside his immediate circle. He folded it back up, put it in his bag, and carried it onto the bus. A few weeks later, he was in Nashville. A few months after that, Luther was gone. And the machine that had been the Tennessee too, the sound that had defined so much of Cash's early work, was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. Carl Perkins did his best. So did the other musicians who cycled through over the years. But it was never quite the same. Something had shifted. Maybe it would have shifted anyway, even without the fire, even without the note. People change. Bands evolve. Time moves forward. But those who were there, who saw Cash in the months and years after Luther's death, say that something in him had gone quiet. Not his voice. That stayed strong until the very end. But something underneath it. Some part of the machinery that had once driven him forward with relentless energy had been damaged, maybe beyond repair. He kept touring. Kept recording. Kept showing up. That was who he was. But the locked box stayed locked. And the questions it contained stayed unanswered. There's a photograph from 1970, taken backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. Cash is standing with a group of musicians, smiling, looking relaxed. But if you zoom in on his face, you can see something in his eyes. Not sadness, exactly. Something closer to vigilance. Like a man who's learned to watch the doors, to pay attention to who's coming and going, to never quite let his guard down. It's a subtle thing. You might not notice it unless you were looking for it. But once you see it, it's hard to unsee. Do you think someone wanted this forgotten? Or do you think it's just one of those stories that slips through the cracks because no one knows how to tell it properly? The torn poster, wherever it is now, is just paper and ink. But the weight it carries is something else. It's the weight of a friendship that ended too soon, of a warning that may or may not have been heeded, of a night in Tulsa that may have been perfectly ordinary, or may have been the beginning of something darker. It's the weight of all the things we don't know about the people we think we do. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, 4 months after June. He was 71 years old. The obituaries talked about his music, his legacy, his impact on American culture. They mentioned the drug addiction, the redemption arc, the late career resurgence with the American Recordings albums. But none of them mentioned Tulsa. None of them mentioned the poster. None of them asked what Luther Perkins might have known, or why a man in Phoenix walked up to Cash in 1967 and handed him something that changed the way he looked at the world. Maybe that's how it should be. Not every question needs an answer. Not every story needs an ending. Some things are meant to linger, to remain unresolved, to sit in the back of your mind like a melody you can't quite place. But every now and then, someone stumbles across a detail, a police report, a photograph, a faint memory of a conversation overheard decades ago, and the story shifts just slightly. It doesn't become clearer, exactly. But it becomes richer. More textured. More real. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we get. A torn poster. A note in the margin. A man who walked away before anyone could ask his name. And the lingering sense that somewhere, buried in the noise and chaos of mid-century America, there's a truth that never quite made it to the surface. Not because it was hidden, but because no one knew where to look.